Welcome, everyone. My name is Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing. And in this Morpheus Tech Brief, we're going to walk through CI/CD pipeline integration for Morpheus. So it's actually a pretty common question that I get in regards to integrating CI/CD pipelines with the Morpheus platform. So for those that are aware, the Morpheus platform, typically one of the major reasons for utilizing the Morpheus platform is to be able to leverage its ability to build out application stacks or instances or virtual machines on-prem or in the public cloud. It's a natural capability to be able to tie that into a CI/CD pipeline in scenarios or situations, especially when you're talking about the ability to be able to stand up ephemeral environments for testing as far as CI/CD pipelines. And so before we delve too much deeper, we're gonna talk about some terms as it relates to CI/CD and what a lot of those mean. Certainly, there's a lot of interest and a lot of information out there about CI/CD pipelines, but certainly want to make sure we level set on what exactly it is that we're talking about. Commonly with CI/CD pipelines, CI meaning continuous integration. Simply during this phase or this aspect of the pipeline is where the testing of the actual source code is going to be done. So as an example, if it were a Node.js application or a Python application or a Golang application, during the CI phase or portion of the CI/CD pipeline, that's where I'm going to do things like linting, syntax checking, those basic smoke tests, unit testing, to make sure that the actual basics of the code are working successfully and appropriately in alignment with common coding standards or practices. We're starting to see this more and more as permeate into those that deal with more of the operations side of the house when we start talking about things like configuration management via Ansible, Chef, Puppet, or even infrastructure as code utilizes something like Terraform, in which we're doing some basic testing or validation of the code. So as an example, with Terraform, you might run the Terraform funt command or Terraform fmt to format the actual Terraform code, or doing some additional commands or arguments or integrations with things like a checkoff or additional functionality that provides testing of the code itself to show that it's in alignment with, as I mentioned, those coding standards or security requirements. Oftentimes we're seeing it more and more with static analysis of the code to ensure that we're not introducing new vulnerabilities to the actual code base itself. And so once that code has been tested, it's been validated, essentially in isolation, when we talk about unit testing, then we need to get to a point of where typically acceptance testing is going to be done. And so by acceptance testing, what we're talking about is the ability to be able to test the application in its entirety. So if we follow this example on the particular slide, what we want to do is we want to be able to test the node application in the actual entirety of the full stack. So the application is going to interact with the database, and as part of that, it's going to need to communicate with the database and create the data and all those processes of actually testing the functional app. And so as part of that, that's going to require the actual application to be ready to test. So that's the database component as well as the actual application component. And so that's where Morpheus can help and come into play, is being able to stand up those instances, those virtual machines, that infrastructure, utilizing something like a CloudFormation or an ARM template or a Terraform, leveraging the aspects of the Morpheus platform that are commonly utilized in a self-service fashion. Now we're simply taking that capability and tying that into our CI/CD pipeline, utilizing things like a REST API call or a CLI call. We'll take a look at those facets or aspects in a second. But from a high level standpoint, what that's allowed us to do is to be able to build out an ephemeral environment from a platform standpoint. So in this scenario, we've gone through the process of integrating Morpheus into our CI/CD pipeline, and it's being triggered to build out that ephemeral testing stack that we're going to use as part of our acceptance testing. So at a high level, that's where Morpheus fits into the broader picture from a CI/CD perspective. So we touched on the CI part. The other aspect in the name is CD. So CD is actually, it has shortened for two different terms. There's continuous delivery, or continuous deployment. Continuous delivery being the idea that I'm, as part of my process of software development, whether it be the traditional software development or even more of the infrastructure-oriented software development, what I'm now looking to do is ensure that every push that I have into my environment as it gets to higher level environments, so let's say to my master branch or right up to my master branch, are ready to go to be deployed into production at a moment's notice. So in essence, continually making the software available for delivery. So in the event that we do have a new update, a new patch, a new fix that needs to go out, essentially at a moment's notice, we can push code into production because it's ready to go as part of what we've done from our rigorous process, as opposed to a scenario in which we have to go through, so to speak, a painstaking process to get ready for a push to production, in which, okay, you know what, we need to do some final testing, some final tune-up, and it might take us a couple of days to get things all buttoned up to get ready to go into production. So as part of the process, we can ensure that each time or each moment we're ready to go into production. So that's continuous delivery. Continuous deployment is going to be the aspect of essentially letting the machines push that code for us or deploy the code for us. So ultimately, it's a full end-to-end process in which, as a developer, I commit my code. It goes through the CI process, does all the testing, goes through the lower level environments, dev, QA, staging, whatever the name or nomenclature might be for a given environment, and then gets automatically promoted to production, given that it aligns with the appropriate guardrails that have been set in place. So that at that point, we're continuously deploying into production, as opposed to continuously delivering to make it ready to go into production. So from a tooling or platform standpoint, it's definitely important to understand the different aspects or nuances of the tools in the space. So in this example, we have our source control, which is a GitLab server. It could be GitHub, it could be insert your source control system of choice. And in this case, we're also utilizing Jenkins as the example for a CI server, oftentimes utilized as a CD server as well, as part of how do I get or deploy my artifacts to my system, or how do I build out the infrastructure that's utilized for the actual hosting of the system. And so sometimes these are conversion into one. So like GitLab could be utilized as a CI and a CD server as well, or you could even expand this out even further, in which source control is one platform, CI server is another platform, and then a CD, dedicated CD platform, is a third one. Certainly it always varies depending upon the organization's desire of number of tools or familiarity or comfortability with certain tools or platforms from a platform standpoint. So I mean, at its core, Morpheus is not a CD server. It does have many of the tools and capabilities to help facilitate CD. Obviously, the ability to be able to integrate or interact with on-prem environments, cloud environments, but also be able to run or execute automation. So in many cases, it's going to be a situation where the CI or CD server is going to call out to Morpheus to build up the environment and tie into all those various facets or components. So by that, what's the benefit of being able to inject Morpheus into this? Once again, many of the benefits that we've already realized by utilizing the Morpheus platform, either in a self-service fashion or as a more powerful mechanism for administrators to be able to stitch together or tie together the various facets of an enterprise IT environment. So in this case, we're taking a look at the application stack in a little more detail and in a more Morpheus-centric fashion. So as we walked through, we talked about the developer committing the code, it going into source control triggering our CI job, which is going to run through the process of unit testing, validation, all those various facets, and then going to call out to Morpheus to be able to spin up that environment. And so a number of ways in which we can do that. We can do that through the Morpheus REST API or the Morpheus CLI. So the Morpheus CLI is going to include a number of capabilities over and above what the API includes. But one of the benefits of the REST API In my opinion, is going to be the ability to be able to have it be a little more customizable. And so by that, I mean being able to utilize something like a Python script or even a shell script to be able to pass data as well as parse data from the appropriate API calls. And so I'll delve a little bit more into that in terms of what I mean by that when we go into some of the examples. But in this scenario, we're then triggering Morpheus via the API or the CLI to build out, in this case, the application blueprint. The application blueprint could be literally the application blueprint itself from a Morpheus nomenclature standpoint. So I could go essentially into the application portion of the platform and then spin up directly this application stack. Or I could also leverage Morpheus' self-service catalog capabilities, and I can call a self-service catalog item via the REST API. And so that's going to provide me with all the benefits that it would if I were provisioning from a catalog item utilizing the Morpheus UI. So typically it's going to be those truncated number of options or inputs that are exposed to me. So that way I can simply provide a smaller payload, let's say, during my CI process, in which I might specify some basic pieces of information without having to essentially utilize the API to generate or populate all the options that would be exposed via an application blueprint. So as we see here to the right of the screen, what we're taking advantage of is those Morpheus integrations to build out, to prep the environment. In many cases, oftentimes what happens is the Morpheus platform is taken advantage of as it relates to the ability to be able to build out operating systems. So being able to spin up single instance virtual machines for Linux or Windows or whatever it might be, but also being able to leverage it for application stacks. In that I can build out the underlying middleware infrastructure. And oftentimes there's a handoff to an operations or an application development team or even a middleware team to then perform the final configuration. But what this allows us to do is start to bring those disparate groups together to marry those capabilities, in which not only can Morpheus be utilized to stand up the underlying infrastructure and get the systems prepped and ready for the application itself, but can start to be leveraged in conjunction with the processes of a deployment standpoint for those applications to be able to spin up those ephemeral environments for testing, but also there's some mechanisms which we can use to even help facilitate some of the deployment to an existing or production instance or workload in which we're not going to be spinning up or tearing them down as part of the pipeline, but simply deploying or upgrading the application in place. So a number of the things we see here, as far as things like vCenter and ServiceNow integration, DNS, IPAM, common things from a Morpheus integration standpoint that provide tremendous value. And so I'm going to take a look at one more thing as it relates to, we walked through at a high level how things tie together, but from a lower level standpoint, what does that really look like from a pipeline perspective? And so we're taking a look at example pipeline stages. Certainly it's going to vary based upon the organization and how they construct pipelines and how they want to build them out. But at a high level, these are many of the various facets or phases of a common pipeline. So initially it's going to be that code commit, which is technically a precursor to the pipeline. So the developer is going to commit their code. It's going to go through the unit testing process, as we mentioned, that linting, that security checking, all those common things from a application-centric standpoint. Then at which point, commonly going to build and push the artifact. Number of ways in which this can actually be accomplished, whether it's something like pushing it into a Docker container or building into a certain packaging format, whether it be something like an RPM or a Debian package, number of ways that can be done. And commonly it's pushed into an artifact repository like a JFrog Artifactory or a Nexus, or a number of options available there for artifact storage as it relates to where my code is going to live from an application-centric perspective. Then at this point, Morpheus unlocks the ability to be able to be called or triggered to stand up an ephemeral environment for some of that additional testing. And so the items or the boxes that are in the light blue are those that would be an interaction with Morpheus. So the CI/CD pipeline would trigger or call Morpheus to stand up the environment. As I mentioned, this could be triggering the build out of a self-service catalog item that might be backed by an instance, instances, or an application blueprint, or the ability to be able to directly call that instance or application blueprint itself. As mentioned, there's a number of differences and potentially benefits and trade-offs that does offer. So once that environment is stood up, I can now essentially utilize acceptance testing frameworks or functionality. So that, as an example, this could be something like Selenium or Python scripts, whatever I might be utilizing for acceptance testing to test oftentimes either number of things. Oftentimes it's going to be application centric, but I could also utilize this phase also to test and validate that even the infrastructure that was stood up actually aligns with what I expect the infrastructure to be. And so we really start to get into that, the full spectrum of being able to test not only the application, but make sure that the environment that it's running on does align with what's expected. And so we really start to tie up and marry multiple disciplines together from an application development perspective, as well as an operations perspective, in which they're leveraging the same pipeline to do so, to be able to take advantage of the testing capabilities of the full end-to-end process. So after the acceptance testing has been performed, and so one thing to note with the acceptance testing, so there's going to be the inputs and the outputs to these various different phases. So as part of the triggering of the provisioning, I'm going to do things like specify which application blueprint or which service catalog item I want to utilize or leverage. And then as part of an output, I'm likely going to look to grab some information about the particular item that was deployed, things like DNS name or an IP address. I could do that in a manner in which I dynamically grab that, or I could also even go the route of potentially having that be more deterministic. And by that, I mean, as part of the CI process, I might have an identifier, something like a CI job number that I append to the name of the application blueprint deployment or the self-service catalog item, which is always going to give me an indicator of, let's say as an example, whenever I deploy this particular application stack, I'm going to use the name CI/CD, and then I'm going to use the job number of the CI/CD system. So what that's going to allow me to do is to deterministically determine what is the name of the actual provisioned object or resource that I want to fetch or obtain additional information about, that being a more deterministic fashion as opposed to leveraging the payload to find out or verify that information. So there's a number of different options that can be taken. So after that acceptance testing has been performed, assuming that everything went successfully, then I might get to a situation where I'm then going to destroy that ephemeral environment as part of the final stages of my pipeline. In a scenario where, let's say there's a failure, I might go through the process of don't destroy the environment. So essentially having that branching logic that evaluates the acceptance testing phase that says, okay, if there was a failure, leave the environment up for me to do some additional testing or some additional evaluation. Potentially there may even be additional phases that perform some automated testing or evaluation that might do something like turn on debug logging or reach out to the system and perform these given operations to grab additional information about the application's running state, as well as the environment itself. But certainly there's a number of things that can be done to further automate that process. And then finally getting to the process of potentially triggering the next pipeline that then helps facilitate code promotion into higher level environments. So now that we've got an understanding, we're going to walk through some of the aspects in which we can tie the Morpheus platform together from a CI/CD perspective. So first thing we'll do is log into Morpheus. So number of things that I talked about as far as being able to utilize or leverage catalog items from a platform standpoint. So as an example, got a catalog item. In this case, I don't have any inputs. I can specify various inputs for a given catalog item that I might want to provide. So as an example, I could specify name as an input. And as we mentioned, being able to utilize that deterministic deployment, I can leverage that functionality to specify the name. But In this case, I don't have a name, but what I'm able to do is do things like take advantage of the REST API as well as the Morpheus CLI from a capability standpoint. So let me jump to the API docs. So one of the things that I mentioned was the API documentation to be able to interact with the Morpheus platform. So there's a number of options or ways in which we can do that. So I could do that through the Morpheus platform. So provisioning, in this case, is what I want to do. So I can specify that I want to create a new app. In this case, I could leverage that, that application blueprint that I might have created from a Morpheus standpoint. So within the platform library blueprints, I can have app blueprints, and then those are the items that I want to be able to instantiate. So if I come to provisioning and apps, I can instantiate a new version of the app. In this case, I can click next. I would do things like specify the name, the group, all those various inputs. I could do that via the Morpheus REST API. And so as part of the deployment, once I trigger that, what's going to happen is it's going to start the deployment of that application stack, in this case, in an ephemeral environment. And that's going to allow me to be able to start standing up that workload as part of the phase of a CI/CD pipeline. So in addition to leveraging the REST API, we can also utilize the Morpheus CLI. So we'll take a look at an example. So if I took a look at an example that I have here of a previous run, so this is Jenkins, a CI/CD platform. In this case, as part of the build out, I am triggering or calling into to Morpheus as part of the process. So if we take a look at the logs, so one of the things we see here is that I am executing a CLI command. So Morpheus apps add, in this case, I'm passing a name to the particular application. So when I would specify the name for the app that I'm provisioning, this would align with that. And then I'm also specifying a payload. So in this case, I'm deploying an application blueprint natively. And so for those that have been through the process of deploying the app through Morpheus, there's a number of options that are available to me for deployment. So we see things like name, group, cloud, various options. This would be me specifying as an example, in a JSON payload. So these various options, I could specify and pass in a payload from the JSON standpoint. So that's where I talked about the trade-off between deploying via an app, which does give more control, gives more flexibility, or whether I wanted to deploy via a service catalog item in which all of these items or most of these items are abstracted from the API endpoint. So it certainly becomes very valuable and beneficial when the CI/CD pipeline is maintained by a different team in which I'm utilizing or leveraging the service catalog capability as essentially an API endpoint to facilitate calls. And so what I mean by that is that truncated option list exposed to the end user. So in the same fashion that I can utilize the self-service catalog functionality to abstract all the options exposed to an end user in the UI, I can do the same thing via the REST API or CLI, in which all of these options don't need to be exposed, only a handful that map to something meaningful on the back end. So that does a number of things, simplifies the payload as far as the initial provisioning via the REST API or CLI, but also provides an abstraction or decouples the actual underlying components of the application from the requester. So what that's going to get us is the ability to be able to change things from an underlying infrastructure standpoint, but still maintain that entryway for that catalog item. So the pipeline is going to still pass 4 or 5 inputs, but on the back end, I can change things of what those inputs map to without breaking the CI/CD pipeline from a functionality standpoint. So it removes that tight coupling of the CI/CD pipeline payload to the actual application from a Morpheus-centric standpoint. So in this case, the CLI is being leveraged, as I mentioned, providing that app name, providing that payload, and then in this case, also utilizing the refresh option. So there's capabilities natively built into the Morpheus CLI to do polling as a mechanism. So there's a number of things that we're pulling back as part of this process. So things like, of particular importance, things like the instances. So in this case, there's 2 instances, there's multiple tiers, and then the status. So in the particular case, the status would be most important to be able to leverage that for validation or decisions about the status of the pipeline. So in this case, I would wait until the status is, as an example, running before I would start to do anything as it relates to acceptance testing. And then at that point, I would still need to pull back the information about things like either IP addresses or DNS names if I wasn't doing that in a deterministic manner. That's going to allow me that capability. So we see it's going through polling and polling and polling. And so the 15 was 15 seconds. Refresh, or poll Morpheus every 15 seconds for the status until it reaches a status of, I believe, either running, which means everything is good to go, or failed, at which point, as its name implies, the build has failed for that particular deployment. So that's going to allow me to be able to integrate Morpheus into my CI/CD pipeline. And so at which point I would get additional information about those instances to be able to utilize or leverage from a integration standpoint. So as one of the things I mentioned was certainly the CLI is very beneficial, includes a number of capabilities. But one of the things that we do recognize or see is that I would have to have some way, if I wasn't doing it in a deterministic fashion, I would have to have some way to parse the actual information about the instances that I wanted to utilize from an acceptance testing standpoint. And so that's where certainly the Morpheus REST API provides a number of benefits and capabilities. Certainly I could wrap the CLI and be able to parse out, let's say, a JSON payload and start to tie that into either some additional automation via a shell script or maybe a Ruby script or a Python script. But certainly there's the ability to be able to leverage something like just a Python script natively to help facilitate that process. So that does provide a number of means by which I can start to build out that glue code, so to speak, from a platform standpoint, where I can leverage the functionality of the Morpheus platform to build out that infrastructure and then perform a subsequent API call to pull back that metadata about the given resource that was deployed. So as part of this build out, so let's take a look at the status. So it went through the deploy process. After it's been deployed, I can pull back that particular information, as I mentioned, and then be able to leverage that for the next subsequent step of acceptance testing. So from a pipeline standpoint, we'll take a quick look at what that actually looks like from a command structure standpoint. So we have to deploy. In this case, as I mentioned, Morpheus CLI has been installed. I'm building out that application, but I could also specify for a cleanup environment. In this case, I've commented it out. I can have additional logic here that goes through the process of destroying the environment. I could add additional logic that might say, okay, if the previous stage of acceptance testing was unsuccessful, then don't destroy the environment, leave it up and running. But if it was successful, then tear down that environment so that it goes away. So whether that environment be virtual machines in an on-prem environment or deployed via something like infrastructure as code or Terraform. Certainly a number of ways in which we can build out the infrastructure. In this way, we start to tie it into the broader CI/CD pipeline process. So now that we've got that done, so quick question here. So pipeline kicks off, does pipeline things? Yep, absolutely. Then after, let's take a look. So then after set stuff, it's got a question that came through. Yeah, so absolutely. So it's a case of the API, either via a native script or the CLI can be utilized to poll and evaluate the status from a Morpheus standpoint. So that way, what's going to happen is the pipeline is going to kick off or trigger that script or that CLI. it's going to iterate against the Morpheus API, evaluate the status of the actual app in Morpheus, then at which point the CLI will respond with that data. At which point you can then either utilize a variable to store the status of whether it was successful or whether it was failed, or you can use exit codes to specify, okay, for a successful provisioning operation, we're going to exit 0 for the actual script or the automation itself, and then we're going to exit 1 or another number for any other failure. So at which point the pipeline now has the information about the actual Morpheus deployment to make that decision or determination of, do I proceed down the path in which I tear down the environment, or do I proceed down the path in which I leave the environment up for additional testing or evaluation? So hopefully that answers the question. Another question came through. Could we trigger Jenkins jobs from Morpheus? So technically, Jenkins pipeline jobs could be triggered from Morpheus utilizing the automation hooks that Morpheus has to, let's say, run a Python script or a bash script to hit the Jenkins REST API to trigger a pipeline. Certainly there's a possibility to do that as part of the build out of an application stack as the tail end. So maybe as I'm building out an application stack in Morpheus, what I want to do is have a job in which that actually handles the application deployment that then ties into the Morpheus stand-up of that particular instance. So certainly a capability. So, and second part of that question is, currently we only see Jenkins jobs from Morpheus when we integrate Jenkins. So at the moment, the integration is a read-only capability, so specifically related to the Jenkins integration within Morpheus. So the triggering of jobs would need to be done through another mechanism. And then the final question we've got is video recording. So this tech brief will be made available on YouTube within a day or two. So certainly can find that on the Morpheus Data YouTube channel for later consumption or sharing with others that may not have been able to attend. So definitely appreciate the time. We've walked through some of the various aspects or facets of CI/CD from a platform standpoint. So number of things to note: getting hands-on experience with Morpheus. There is the Morpheus Community Edition that can be downloaded by going to morpheusdata.com/community. There is the community forum for finding additional information, so discuss.morpheusdata.com. And then finally, for those that may not be Morpheus users or customers, being able to take advantage of a demo from one of our SCs by going to morpheusdata.com/demo. So definitely appreciate the time, and thank you for everyone for joining.